Welcome to Retrieving Data. In this session, we'd like to discuss how we are able to retrieve data in OutSystems. And there are two major ways for us to do that. We can use aggregates to retrieve data, and we can use SQL queries. When we use aggregates, there are a number of things we need to define about them and things that we can control to go ahead and get exactly the types of data that we're looking for. And when we use SQL queries, obviously there'll be inputs and outputs, and then we'll execute that SQL to go ahead and get the data that we're interested in. So let's get started looking at how we can define the types of data that we're looking for through these two different approaches. So when we think about retrieving data, we mentioned that we do have aggregates, and aggregates have an icon. The aggregates are available both on the mobile and on the web side, and there's no SQL background really needed. All you need to do is be able to think about the types of things that you want, and the editor will help you visually describe those, and then it will attempt to go ahead and build the request to get you what you're looking for. When we talk about SQL queries, really this is a server-side thing only. So when we think about having the SQL queries, we can't run SQL queries on the mobile devices themselves. We can only run them on the server side. So the SQL queries can run any type of custom SQL that you're interested in. It can even have access to database specific. So if you have an Oracle database and you want to run a particular command, you can do that, and the bulk operations are all there as well. So we could go ahead and get clients from a particular table, and we could go ahead and get that information using an aggregate or using a SQL query. SQL query has a little bit more flexibility. The aggregates are a little bit easier and quicker to build if you get used to using the visual editing. Once we run these queries, whether it's an aggregate or a SQL query, there will be output. And typically when we're asking for information from a table, there may be a list of those coming back. And from that list, we should also get the count of how many of those types of things that we were looking for came back. So when we begin working with this in OutSystems, OutSystems visually shows the aggregate as a variable and as something that exists. And then right below it, it shows the list itself. And then if we go further down, you can see that the count comes back. And then once we're inside the list will have many different items, so whichever one of the list is the current one. So if we have a list of clients, then the current client in the list of clients will have an ID and have a name. And then we'd also be able to know if this is a current one in the list, what row number in the list are we, what's the length of the list, or is the list currently empty. So there are different types of information that we're going to get as part of the output, and having this type of information can be important because we may have to loop over the information that comes back from the database, and we have a for each capability that we can use in actions, and then we'll be able to loop over these lists to get the types of data that we need back. So inside of aggregates, we can create aggregates in a number of different ways. If we're on the mobile side, we can actually attach an aggregate directly to a screen. So here we can see the home screen that is a mobile screen that's available. And if we right click on the home screen, we can fetch data from the database. Because this is a mobile device, we could fetch data from local storage because we might have a local storage entity. And then we can fetch data from other places. So once we say we'd like to fetch data, it will go ahead and create an aggregate for us, and it will give it a default name of aggregate 1, and that aggregate 1 will be attached to the home screen. Once the aggregate is there, it says please drag and drop some sort of entity or attribute so we know what to try to retrieve with this aggregate. And we could go over to the data tab and we could say give us the clients, and then it would go ahead and create the aggregate to retrieve clients for us. So this is one way to go ahead and create aggregates. Once we create the aggregate, then the aggregate editor opens, and you can see that because we chose the clients entity, it changed from the name aggregate to get clients. And you can see over in the home screen it changed it to get clients, and right below it shows the client entity, and if we open it, it shows its structure. so that we can get all the information about the structure of the data that is available. Until we publish, it will give us this warning saying, hey, we know you want clients and we know clients are the source of this particular aggregate, but we don't have the capability of bringing back any preview data because we don't have access. It hasn't been published yet. So we have to publish things to be able to get the access to them. Now, over here in the details, when we look at the properties of a get client aggregate, it will have a server request timeout. It will have a maximum number of records to bring back. And if you want to see, sometimes as we build aggregates, they get more and more complex, see the type of SQL that will be executed to go ahead and run this type of query to get this information back, we can go look at the executed SQL. It's here and it's part of the properties. If we double click on it, it opens and we can see it. Now, not only can we attach aggregates to screens, but a lot of times we'll be using aggregates in flows. And to be able to do that, we'll go to the aggregate inside of the toolbox, and when we drag and drop it from the toolbox, we can put it inside of any action flow in between the start and the end of an action. And the same thing will happen. It will bring up the generic aggregate 1 editor. We'll have to choose some entity or attributes, and then it will be a defined aggregate that will be used inside of this action flow. So let's look at the aggregate editor in a little more detail. It's basically an Excel-like display of the real data that's available in that particular table. We can add more entities to any given entity that we're currently working on, and that will add different sources to this particular aggregate at the moment. So this aggregate at the moment is getting clients, but if we wanted to do something a little more interesting, like get clients from a state or something like that, we could add another source to go ahead and make sure that we find and join some of the information about addresses and states and other types of things. So we can have different sources, we can have different filters, we can sort information, and we can use some test values. So all of this is available inside of the aggregate. If we click on sources, here we can see that we have clients and we have products. So we may have a client ID inside of the client ID. We may have different products that have been purchased, and the product has a client ID because we know who the product belongs to as far as that particular client. So we could join these two tables and say I want the clients with or without the products. So I need all of the clients back, and if there are products related to it, great, bring that information with it. And if not, I don't need that information. So there are joins, and similarly to in databases, we know that there are inner joins and outer joins, left-hand joins. We have a number of different descriptions here, such like we could have clients with products, and then we'd get both, and we'd get all of it, or clients with or without. So there are a number of different choices there, and the types of different choices that are available refer to or relate to some of the different types of joins that we can do. Now, besides the sources, once we have the sources, we may want to filter some of the data, and filtering the data just basically becomes the SQL where clause. So we can say give us these sources, so maybe we're getting clients with or without products, and we want the clients with or without products when the client ID for the client entity that we're working with is the input that came in from the screen or the action or whatever else. So we have an input client ID, and that's what we're going to search for. So that will typically, if it's a client and it's a single ID, will return 1 instead of those. And then once we have the information back, we could sort it. We could sort it by the client's name. We could do ascending sorts and descending sorts. So lots of interesting things to be able to deal with. And that really works on, in the sorting, the same type of thing that we would do with order by. Now, the sort that we just saw a second ago was a regular sort, and it would be on one of the attributes that's available from the set of entities that we're working with as sources. But we may want to be able to do dynamic sorting, and dynamic sorting would be done with some sort of information that was passed in as a variable. So here you can see an input variable, And we can either say that we want to go ahead and sort this according to a particular entity and its attribute. And if we do that, we have to use this structure to go ahead and format the string so that it knows that we are talking about a particular entity and its attribute. Or if we have what we call computed attributes, you can just write the computed attributes name and it will be fine there as well. And then we can choose whether we're going to sort these descending or ascending, and that can be defined here as well. So there's a slight difference between just a sort of an individual type of attribute and a dynamic sort that can come in from variables that we're working with. And last but not least, a very interesting and useful thing is test values. So we can define different types of information coming in, and we can go ahead and give it a test value, and then there's a test button, and once we click the test button, it brings back the information that would be returned if someone had the input that was this particular ID. So that can help us kind of test things before, and it's basically a preview, but it helps us at development and design time know what we're looking for. So this means that we now have aggregates that have lots of flexibility and we can test them out, which is kind of cool. This does give us sort of an Excel spreadsheet kind of look and feel so that we can see which entities, which attributes they show up as columns, what's available. If we end up having multiple entities with lots and lots of attributes, we may get overwhelmed by the amount of information we have on the screen. At any given time, you can go ahead and right-click on one of the entities and its attributes and say that you'd like to hide it. And once we hide it, it slides and becomes just a tab in between the other entities and attributes that had existed there. So you can control the look of what's happening inside of our aggregate editor so that you get the information that you need and you don't get overwhelmed by the rest of the stuff. You also have the capability in these aggregates to aggregate functions. So if we go back 1 second and look at the hide capability, when we went to hide this attribute, we also had the capability of grouping by this product ID. And we could group by any of these particular columns. So we could group by the product ID, we could group by the client ID, and when we group by those things, then we can also use different types of functions, like we could count them and do some other things. So when we go to aggregate the records or rows, we could go ahead and say, yes, I'd like to go ahead and group all of the IDs, and when I group all of the IDs, I'd like the count of those IDs. So here, if we're grouping by client ID, and we can see that there are 6 client IDs, the count comes up as 6. So there are a number of different things we can do. We can sum them, average them, find the max and min, do a count. So all of those things are available to us because we may need that type of data from the tables that we're working with, especially when we're joining tables and have more complex data. And then last, we have some computed ad hoc attributes. So you can see that at the end of the list of attributes that we have, we always have this new attribute button. And if we click on the new attribute button, it will create a new attribute. We can give it a name, and then we can define the formula or the way in which this will be computed. So if we were looking at certain types of products, then we might want to create the total price for those products. And we'd like the amount and take the amount of a particular product that's being ordered times its unit price. Those may be attributes that are available, and we could go ahead and create this extra attribute that's a calculated and computed attribute because we already have all the information we have that's being returned from the query that we're running. So those are aggregates. That's the editor, and that's what lets us get our information back. A lot of times when information comes back from an aggregate, it will be a list. So there will be lots of information. So it could be just a list of integers, or we were looking at a list of clients. Sometimes it'll be a list of multiple entities. So because we did a join, it'll be a list and it'll have some country info, some date info, some text info, and all of those come back as part of that query. So those will be created as part of the output, and those outputs will often be what we just mentioned as a list. So here we can see an action flow, and we're creating an aggregate that says get customers that might be named Michael. So we create whatever that aggregate is by listing the sources and the filters and the things that we do. And then when we get the information back, we'll see that when that aggregate runs, it returns a list of current. So this will be the current selected row inside of the list, and the customer is available. So the customer will, in this case, will have access to its last name. So this is the way the normal information looks if we run a simple aggregate on one type of data, one entity, and we're looking for one set of information. Sometimes we're actually going out and say we're trying to retrieve information about movies that are currently in different cinemas and theaters. Well, to do that, we might have joined several different sources. We needed all the cinema information, we needed the movie information, and then we had a referenced attribute that we called movie session. Well, if we have that type, then we could actually say get movies with cinemas will return a list, and that list will have all of this information. So if we wanted to see that type of information, how could we see it? Or if we're assigning that to an output variable, maybe we wanted to add extra information to it. How could we do that? Well, one of the things that we could do is we could come in and say that we'd like to use the data type editor to go ahead and modify what's coming back. And in this particular case, the output variable can see that when the aggregate brings information back, it had cinema information, movie, and movie session information, and then we could have added a new attribute. So here it says add an attribute. We can add this extra text attribute, and we can go ahead and define it. We can give it whatever name we want. It could be a different type, but we do have the capability of creating new types, especially when they're going to be in variables. They can then consume or hold all of the information from the aggregate and anything extra that we'd like to be able to go ahead and add to it. So that takes care of the aggregates. There are also SQL queries, and the SQL queries are the things that give us a little bit more power because we can get whatever we want. In the aggregates, we're limited to the way we join the sources and the types of filters and the types of sorting that are available. The aggregates are really nice because it's visual and it's quick, but if you need something a little more powerful because you actually want to write your own SQL statement, you can go ahead and do that. So inside of the SQL queries, we're basically manually writing our own SQL, and we can go ahead and do all the things that you might be used to. So you can go ahead and look for the different entities and their attributes, and if you know a lot about SQL, you'll be able to handle that. Now, when you work inside of the SQL editor, you'll notice that there's a very specific way of representing entities because we need the curly brackets around them, and then any of the attributes have square brackets, and there will be highlighting so that we know all of the SQL keywords are in blue, all of the entities are in black in the brackets, and any of the attributes are in red in the square brackets. So we can come in and write whatever type of SQL that we want. If we need input parameters, we can define them up here at the top, and we need to be able to define what the output structure is. So here, if we're selecting client and all of the rows from the client and we're ordering it by name, obviously we're going to get a list of clients back, so the output entity structure is the client entity, that table that we're actually bringing back. So lots of information that we need to put into the SQL query to be able to get that information back. So there may be input parameters, and if there's an input parameter and we want to use it in the query, which if we have an input parameter, we should be using it somewhere, it will show up as green. And it has a little @ symbol in front of it so that we can go ahead and know where it's being used and again highlight exactly where some of the pieces are in the actual query. Now, right below the information at the top, we have the capability of not just looking at the SQL, but doing test input. So just like we could test the aggregate, we can test this SQL query. We can go ahead and have the different parameters. They're going to have test values, put in the test value because this was the input. So here's the value that would have been input. And then if we clicked on test output, and we ran the query, it would show us what the output of that query would be. Sometimes it's nothing. So when we do hit the test button, we have to be careful about the types of input that we have, because occasionally there will be nothing there, and if there's nothing here, it will show you the number of rows returned so that you can tell it did actually run and there weren't any errors. It's just that you got nothing returned. And then we define the SQL with all of those entities and attributes and keywords and variables that are coming in. Underneath the covers, it's having to make this call to the OutSystems server, and you can actually see the details of what that real query is going to be. This isn't really human readable. It's a lot of the generated code that OutSystems creates for us, but occasionally if you're debugging or trying to solve complicated problems because there's some sort of error, you may use this. We try to stay away from that and not have to worry about this, but occasionally it's something that you may need to understand and be able to work with. Now there's one other thing that you can do with the SQL statement that is interesting, and that is sometimes we want to create or use a SQL statement against the tables that we're working with, but we don't need it to be a query, we just want it to do something. So say we wanted to just delete the product table. Well, we can go ahead and write delete from product and it will get rid of the product table. But for us to be able to do that, we do always have to have an output entity structure. So in this case, we're deleting things. There really is no return or output, but we do have to have just a default dummy output here. Any kind of structure or entity would be fine, and then it will go ahead and run this and it will do what it needs to do. So not only are the SQL queries queries, but occasionally we can use the SQLs sort of as commands or statements against the database to get it to do what we want. So we spent a decent amount of time looking at aggregates and how we can use the visual editor to set up the sources and filter and sort and do some of the more advanced things with aggregates so that we can get data fairly quickly without having to know a huge amount about SQL. If you know a lot about SQL already, then just go ahead and add the input parameters that you need, define the outputs. You'll be able to see the executed SQL and have all of the control that you're used to. So you have these two different approaches and you'll be able to use those to get data on the server side. When we work inside of the mobile devices, especially with local storage, we have to work with just the aggregates. So this hopefully gave you a good idea of how to retrieve data. You're going to get a chance to use this a lot as we begin building more applications.